Hi everybody, welcome back. In this lecture, we'll consider the third of the four potential solutions to the externality problem that exists between our steel plant and its neighbors. And this third potential solution to the problem is called the Pigovian tax, named after the economist who first proposed something like it, an English economist named Arthur Cecil Pigou. The Pigovian tax is, as it were, a kind of poor relation to the class action suit. Like the class action suit, it amalgamates, as it were, all of the claims of the neighbors into a single claim against the steel plant, and if the claim succeeds, the steel plant is charged an amount equal to the government authorities' best estimate of what the total amount of damage done by the crud being tossed in the air has actually been. So, like the class action suit, there's one proceeding in which the liability of the steel plant is determined, and the steel plant is forced to pay an amount which is estimated to be equal to the sum total of the damages that it's imposed. But that total is not paid directly to the victims of the externality, that is, the people who have had their entitlement to good health seized from them without compensation. It's a tax. And as a result of its being a tax, the revenue from the liability payment goes into the coffers of the government, and the government decides what it can do, what it should do with those proceeds. It can use the proceeds for the benefit of the people who have actually suffered the costs. In our example, it might, for example, build a park for the people who live around the plant to provide them with an amenity that they wouldn't have. Since the park is public, the argument could be made that the park benefits everybody and thus represents a kind of compensation, not monetary compensation, but compensation of a sort for the costs that the neighbors have suffered at the hands of the steel plant. But as everyone knows, governments often don't do things like that, and so it's quite possible that the tax would be simply stored in the general revenues and used by the government for some purpose that has nothing to do with ameliorating the situation of the people who have actually suffered the cost. So, the Pigovian tax, although it bears a familial relation to the class action, has two crucial differences from the class action solution itself. The first is that it replaces the lawsuit represented by the class action with an administrative proceeding in which a board, an administrative entity, simply gathers what evidence it can to determine the appropriateness of inflicting the tax on the steel plant and gathers whatever information it can about the costs that the steel plant's activities have imposed on the plant's neighbors. But in the class action suit, as we've seen, there's testimony under oath and a relatively thorough attempt to get at the actual costs that have been imposed by the cost imposer in any given class action suit. That is, courts are in a position to get certain kinds of evidence at a much deeper level than administrative boards are able to get it, and to produce the people who have actually suffered the costs so that they may testify under oath about the costs that they've suffered at the hands of the cost imposer. And this, of course, has, in the case of individual tort suits, extremely high transactions costs, and the legal proceeding itself makes even the class action suit a costly way to realize the liability payment. The Pigovian tax, administered not by a court but by an administrative board, will generally incur fewer transactions costs even than a class action suit for determining liability and inflicting the payment, but it's a less reliable cost estimator than a class action suit and a much less reliable cost estimator than the individual tort suits that we spoke of earlier. The second difference between the Pigovian tax and the class action is that the class action suit, like individual tort liability suits, and like the act of exchange itself, where transactions costs don't block free exchanges, the class action suit preserves the link between the cost imposer and the cost bearer in the liability proceeding. We've described the liability proceeding as a two-part transaction. One might think of it as a game of slaps, as American children call it. The cost imposer slaps the victim at one moment in time, and then the victim, in a liability proceeding at some later moment in time, administers a compensatory slap back at the cost imposer, and the transaction is completed. This is another way of looking at a situation where the cost imposer inflicts a cost by taking the cost bearer's entitlement, and then subsequently in the liability proceeding, the cost bearer retrieves the value of the entitlement by extracting a liability payment with the help of the court from the cost imposer. So costs that are imposed by the cost imposer on the cost bearers are compensated through the payment of the liability judgment. That is, just as in a real exchange, the person who takes something away from the neighbors must pay those same neighbors the value of what's been taken from them. But in the Pigovian tax, that link between the cost imposer and the cost bearer may well be broken. As I've said, it may be the case that the government will choose to expend the revenues that it gets from the steel plant in some way for the benefit of the individuals who have actually suffered the cost. But if it doesn't, then that crucial link between the cost imposer and the cost bearer is broken, and the critical compensatory function of the liability system is abandoned in favor of lower transactions costs. All of the discussion we've had to this point has emphasized the costliness of the various ways in which externality relationships can be resolved through the imposition of liability or through the imposition of a Pigovian tax. A major problem with all liability systems, unlike pure exchange systems, is that where in exchange systems I'm free to decide whether or not to surrender my property rights to some other person, nothing will take place without my consent, and therefore costs are not imposed upon me unless I am able to extract the compensatory cost and the act of exchange immediately upon surrendering my property right. But as everybody knows, liability systems are imperfect. Not just imperfect in their inability to perfectly match the terms of trade that would take place in an actual voluntary free exchange, but they're also imperfect in the sense that not every cost imposer is apprehended and brought to court and faced with the possibility of paying the compensation for the costs that they've imposed. Many cost imposers get away with it. That is to say, they seize unlawfully the entitlements of their victims, but their victims are unable, for some reason or other, to sue them in court and to win the compensatory liability payment that would complete the transaction. So some cost imposers in the real world impose costs upon others, but never are forced to pay compensation for those costs. Some cost imposers are caught, and so the question is, how shall we deal with the cost imposers who are caught in light of the fact that many, perhaps most, or perhaps almost all of the cost imposers as a class are never caught at all and therefore never brought to bear, have never had the costs of their activities brought to bear on their decisions. This introduces a problem that we'll call probability scaling, and I'll introduce the problem with a short story about a famous British admiral named Sir John Byng. Admiral Byng, who lived in the 18th century, was sent by his superiors in the year 1756 with a fleet of ancient, creaky warships to help defend a British garrison on the island of Minorca off the coast of Spain. Byng duly took his ships to Minorca, but the ships were in terrible condition, and as a result of their bad condition, he was pummeled by a French fleet as he approached the garrison at Minorca. Because his ships were destroyed, he'd done the best that he could. He decided that he couldn't possibly lift the French siege on Minorca, and after firing a few desultory shots back at the French, Byng turned his fleet around and returned to Britain, leaving the garrison at Minorca to the tender mercies of the French. All sides agreed that Byng had not acted unreasonably. All sides agreed that Byng had done the very best he could to lift the siege, and all sides agreed that it was very unlikely that he would be able to lift the siege with the leaking, unsuitable boats that he had at his disposal. Nonetheless, Byng was court-martialed for failure to do his utmost to relieve the garrison at Minorca, and in 1757, after a court-martial, he was shot for dereliction of duty. This raised quite a fuss because it seemed that Byng had been shot for offenses that certainly did not rise to the level of seriousness that would deserve the extreme penalty that he received. And in the midst of the controversy, the great French writer Voltaire, whose picture you see on the slide, had one of his characters say memorably, "In Britain, it is thought well to kill an admiral from time to time to encourage the others." So let's talk about probability scaling a little bit. If exchange or liability worked perfectly, that is, if everybody who imposed a cost were identified and brought to pay compensation to the person to whom they had inflicted a cost, if the system of exchange or the system of liability worked perfectly, then every cost imposer would have an incentive to impose costs only where the cost imposition pays for itself. That is to say, where the cost imposer derives more benefit or economic value from imposing the costs than the costs that he's imposed upon his victims itself. If that is the case, then it's possible for the cost imposer to fully compensate the cost bearers for the costs that they have borne and still have a little bit left over for himself. That's what the next slide suggests, so that in this circumstance, cost imposers, under perfect conditions, commit only what we might call efficient acts of cost imposition. That is, acts of cost imposition that produce greater economic value for the cost imposer than they produce economic cost for the cost bearers. If a cost imposition is efficient, then social welfare, measured by economic value, is increased by the commission of the cost imposition or the commission of the tort, because more social value, more economic wealth has been created by the tort itself than cost has been created on the part of the people who have suffered as a result of the tortious activity. And this leads to an efficient amount of cost imposition. That is, the amount of cost imposition that maximizes the total value of all property rights to the people who hold them. But then the question arises, what if some cost imposers aren't caught and therefore never have to pay compensation? Let's discuss a simple example of such a situation. Suppose that there are a whole group of cost imposers, in our example, a whole range of steel plants, maybe 20 or 40 or 50 of them. And let's suppose every one of these cost imposers is identical in the sense that each one imposes a $100 cost on the victims of their cost imposition. That is, the value of the good health taken by each and every one of these 50 plants, let us say, is equal to $100. But let's also assume that only one such factory in 5 is ever brought to the bar of justice and made to pay compensation to the people who have borne costs as a result of its activity. This means that the probability that any one imposer will ever have to pay the fine is 1 out of 5, or 0.2. So the probability that I've indicated on the slide of 0.2 represents the probability that any particular cost imposer will be the unlucky one who is brought to bar and thus made to pay compensation. Now suppose some unlucky steel firm, the one in five, is actually caught, actually sued, and actually brought to bar in a tort liability suit for the damages that that cost imposer has imposed. Recall that the cost imposition was at the level of $100. So if the liability judgment for this cost imposer were to perfectly reflect the costs that the imposer had imposed on his victims, then the liability price would be $100. But if the liability price is $100, then in the future, because only one steel plant in five is ever apprehended and made to pay a compensation price at all, each steel plant faces not the real liability price of $100, but what mathematicians would call an expected price, which represents the $100 price multiplied by the likelihood that any one steel plant is actually going to be made to pay that price. So if I believe that there's a 1 in 5 chance that I'll pay a $100 fine or a $100 liability payment, then the expected liability payment or the expected price that I will pay for my cost imposing activity, which recall actually imposes $100 worth of cost on my victims, the price that I will expect to pay is much lower than that. It's 0.2 times $100 or $20. And that price is inefficiently low. If I only have to pay an expected cost of $20 for each act of pollution that actually imposes $100 worth of cost, then I will impose more pollution than the efficient allocation would prescribe. That is, I will take some entitlements for whom I am not, in fact, the highest valuing owner, because the price that I actually have to pay for those entitlements is substantially discounted by the fact that I'm not likely to actually be made to pay at all. But if the price is scaled upward to reflect the uncertainty of apprehension, and it's scaled upward, say, to $500, then every steel plant in the future, where there's a 1 in 5 chance that any steel plant will be apprehended and made to pay compensation, if the price, the liability price, is scaled upward to $500, then the expected price that faces every steel plant is the probability of 0.2 that any steel plant will in fact be captured and made to pay the compensation, multiplied by the now higher liability price for those poor firms that are unlucky enough to be captured and have to pay compensation. The payment's been scaled upward to $500, so 0.2 times 500 produces an expected price of $100 in the future for every steel plant that pollutes. Since each steel plant, by assumption, is polluting to the effect of $100 worth of cost, then under this new scheme, where the unlucky steel plant which is caught has to pay a much larger than $100 liability price, the effect of this probability scaling has been to face each steel plant in the future with an expected price that is exactly equal to the damages that its cost imposition will actually impose. So, if we abstract away from attitudes about the riskiness that this situation poses for firms, and we assume that firms will behave the same way in the face of an expected price that they would behave in the face of a certain payment equal to the expected price, then cost imposers under the higher penalty will once again impose only those costs that pay for themselves, just as they would under perfect conditions, despite the fact that only some, and perhaps a very few, cost imposers are ever caught or made to pay, and those that do pay will be made to pay more, perhaps much more, than would be justified by their own cost imposition, so as to provide the proper incentive for those who escape the requirement of payment. So by scaling the probability up to reflect the uncertainty that any given steel firm will be made to pay, we single out a particular few of the steel firms who are unlucky enough to be the 1 in 5 who are caught, and we charge each of those steel firms a liability price that is much greater than the actual the actual level of the costs that the steel firm has imposed upon other people. All steel firms impose a $100 cost, but the 1 in 5 that is caught has to pay a $500 liability price, a disproportionate liability price. So they are punished disproportionately, the unlucky few, and perhaps very disproportionately for what they have actually done, so as to encourage the other steel plants who have been lucky enough to evade punishment, just like the unfortunate Admiral Byng. I see I've spent a little bit more time talking about this than I thought I would, and so I'll consider the fourth of our possible solutions to the externality problem in the next lecture.